Everyone remembers their first gaming PC and how cool it was to dip their toes into PC gaming. My first computer was a Dell Optiplex 780 full tower, which I got in about 2014. Its big features is that it had a Core 2 Duo E8400, which is a slow CPU then, let alone now, 8GB of RAM, and a 2TB hard drive. Even though I wasn't suited for it, I gamed on it hardcore, with games like Minecraft peaking at about 12 FPS usually, using those sweet integrated motherboard graphics. Needless to say, I ended up selling it a few years back to get some cash so that I could build a better gaming PC. 6 months ago, I so happened to get this Dell Optiplex 960 from a friend who said I could have it for free if I could fix it. I noticed that it was essentially a smaller version of the 780 I had years prior, with the same E8400 CPU, but less RAM and a smaller hard drive. One hard drive swap along with an upgrade from 4GB to 6GB of DDR2 RAM, and it's been doing decent. However, it is not as snappy compared to modern low-end CPUs, which is due primarily to the 2-core, 2-threaded CPU and the older chipset of the motherboard. I can't really change the chipset cheaply, but I can upgrade the CPU cheaply. So I have decided to purchase a Core 2 Quad Q6600 for $11. The Q6600 is a 4-core, 4-threaded chip that runs a little bit slower than the E8400, but it has double the cores. I'm also going to attempt to do the tape mod on the Q6600, which should work. The mod should overclock the CPU from the base 2.4 GHz to 3 GHz, which is the same speed as the E8400, so that I am doubling the cores and at the same speed. This doubling of performance will only hold true if the CPU cooler can keep up with the increased heat load of the new overclocked CPU. Here's the layout of the Optiplex 960 small form factor PC. So here we have the Optiplex 960 small form factor. Just gonna pop the top off here. It's this nice mechanism where you just press that, and this comes off. Can't even do it with one hand. And like any small form factor, it's pretty packed in the amount of stuff they have. So kind of a weird thing, but if you press these two, pull up, get a look at the hard drive. Originally there was a 256 Seagate hard drive, but I upgraded this to a 500 gigabyte Hitachi hard drive. And then kind of under there, like you'll see, there's some RAM sticks. Originally there's 4 gigabytes in there, but I ended up upgrading it to 6 because that's what I had. Right here is the nice and slim DVD drive that also does CDs. Here's the power supply, where, if I remember correctly, 235 watts, which, for like older components and the fact that it does have a PCIe port, but I wouldn't recommend sticking a very power hungry one in there, especially because there's no PCIe connector. And then also kind of a funny thing, and I'll have to lift this up again, but the CPU cooler is actually 2 fans. Like in the middle here is a heat sink, and there's 2 fans. So despite it be, and then the cooler is kind of like just one of those standard Dell, it's hard to see, but it's like one of those standard like flower, kind of like flowers out, kind of like the hand. But the 2 fans do really help it keep it cool, even when they're not running very loud. I took some benchmarks of the E8400 to set a baseline. The CPU-Z benchmarks are not very good compared to today's CPUs, but the Prime 95 temperatures are pretty good. At 67 degrees Celsius after 30 minutes of Prime 95 indicates good cooling. Once I got the Q6600 from the postage, I took out the E8400 from the socket, cleaned off the thermal paste from the CPU and the heatsink, and then put in the Q6600 along with some thermal paste in the heatsink and the fans to assure it works. The benchmarks indicated that the Q6600 was running correctly, as its single core score was a little bit lower than the E8400 due to its lower stock clocks, but the multi-score was much better due to it having double the cores. The Prime 95 test indicates that it does run hotter than the E8400, but it did flatline after reaching 78 degrees Celsius due to the fans ramping up after 75 degrees Celsius was reached. I also noticed that Windows was a little bit snappier, indicating that Windows was using the 2 extra cores.
Now, time for the tape mod.
The Q6600 needed one very small piece of tape to cover a certain pad on the CPU, which somehow ups the front side bus speed of the Q6600 from 1066 MHz to 1333 MHz, which in turn ups the core clocks from 2.4 GHz to 3 GHz. There are other videos on YouTube that do a much better explanation than I could ever do, which I highly recommend checking out if you're interested in this. But after I applied the tape, I put the Q6600 back into the socket to test to see if it would work. After a stressful few seconds. The computer booted and it worked. CPU-Z showed it running at 3 GHz, and the benchmark also showed it, with it almost matching the single core speed of the E8400, and it also got a 20% increase in the multi-core score compared to stock clocks. Unfortunately, I ran into a bit of a small problem. Prime 95 wasn't playing nice with this overclock, as I tried multiple tests, but in every single test, one random core just wouldn't be stressed, and one time, after starting the test, the computer crashed. I ended up resorting to CPU-Z's stress test, which stressed all the cores and wasn't crashing. Although it's not as intense as Prime 95, it's a more realistic stress test for this computer, as it's not going to be rendering and it's not going to be gaming. And the temperatures didn't exceed 75 degrees Celsius due to the lower stress test, but also because I did a better thermal paste application this time with the Q6600. And browsing on Windows seemed to be a little bit faster compared to the non-overclocked CPU. Despite the Prime 95 issue, I would say that this mod was a complete success, as it gives the old Optiplex a little bit more snappiness in Windows 10, and although the idle temperatures are slightly higher than at stock, as long as it doesn't go through any high CPU intensive tasks, the computer will be perfectly fine. If you have a Q6600, especially with a non-overclocking motherboard, I highly recommend doing this, as it's free performance, all for the price of a careful application of a small piece of electrical tape. Thank you very much for watching, and have a scrumptious day.